Hey there, this is Natalie, and today I want to do something a little bit different. For you see, I'm going to be doing an isekai tier list live on stream tomorrow. That is Sunday the 20th of February if you're watching this in the future. And in preparing for that, I made a list of all the isekai shows I wanted to include on it. As I was looking at this list, I started to think about how people generally view isekai as a genre, and I was also thinking about a video I saw by Yahtzee of Zero Punctuation fame in his Extra Punctuation series, where he analysed a load of games to try to figure out if the common complaint that all games feature white male protagonists was actually fair or not anymore. And he did this by comparing the diversity of game protagonists from the past 2 years to the same number of game protagonists from a period 10 years earlier. I kind of realised that with this list of isekai I had, I could do a similar thing and work out whether the isekai genre really is, say, predominantly male power fantasies, whether the protagonists are really all self-inserts for teenage otaku boys, whether harems, OP heroes, and generic fantasy settings were really as common as we tend to think, and basically, just how many generic SAO clones there really are. In short, I decided to try to actually quantify how samey and generic isekai of the past 10 years really is. My findings will shock and amaze you, so keep watching for some very sexy things like pie charts, and please also consider subscribing and ringing the bell because it really helps me out if you do. So, which shows were included? Well, the list is on screen right now, so feel free to pause because I'm not reading out 48 light novel length titles. In choosing them, my criteria were that they had to be modern, narrow K style isekai, so what I guess would in casual terms be stuff that got popular in anime form after Sword Art Online. This is because I think most people see modern isekai as a genre in its own right, and different to the many older series in various genres that had an isekai premise, like say Inuyasha, Digimon, Escaflowne, or Those Who Hunt Elves. So, all of the shows on the list are from the 2010s or 2020s. Secondly, they all had to be shows I've seen enough of to feel like I can rank them. But because I used to write isekai harem novels and watched basically whatever I could in the genre to kind of analyse what did and didn't work, and now I primarily talk about isekai on this YouTube channel, I have actually watched at least a few episodes of the vast majority of isekai that has come out in that time period. So there are 48 shows on the list, and Christ, what am I doing with my life? Now, there are some I haven't got around to watching yet, and so which aren't on the list, such as Drifters and By the Grace of the Gods. But for the purposes of the analysis I'm about to go into, I can say from looking at lists of all isekai anime adaptations to come out in the past decade or so, the ones I haven't seen are not in the majority the generic kind anyway, so I don't think leaving them off is skewing the outcomes of this analysis in a way that misrepresents anything. For instance, I don't really enjoy the slow life genre, so I think there are a couple of slow life type isekai I've skipped over, but that style of story is not where you'd find your Jesus-kun, power fantasy, black hair harem daddies anyway. As for what counts as an isekai, well, honestly, I don't even really think Sword Art Online itself counts as an isekai from a technical perspective. It's actually more of a sci-fi premise. But given what I'm really looking at is this narrow K type genre, and Sword Art Online is really one of the most iconic examples of that, SAO is included, as is Full Dive, which is also about someone in a full dive game world type scenario, rather than being transported to an actual real other world, but which I think satisfies enough of the feel of the genre to qualify. I didn't extend this to any other MMO-based sci-fi type shows though, like Axel World, because I didn't want things to get too messy. Besides, SAO really does need to be here as the benchmark for what makes something an SAO clone. When it comes to reverse isekai, well, Normally I would say these count as part of the genre, so shows like The Devil is a Part-Timer and Jahi-sama, but since it can start taking us into some grey areas, where things like Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid or Beelzebub technically count as reverse isekai, but really don't have that isekai light novel feel at all, I decided that for the tier list I'd include The Devil is a Part-Timer, just because it felt wrong to leave it off, but no other reverse isekai series. Then, for the purposes of this analysis of my list of 48, I just left it in there, because it doesn't really do much to change the outcomes, and most people do consider it a part of the isekai genre. I'm not including any fantasy narrow K type stories that don't have the protagonist being in another world though, even if they are otherwise fairly indistinguishable from isekai in feel. So there's no Danmachi, no Goblin Slayer, no suppose a kid from the last Dungeon Boonies moved to a starter town, and happily, none of this season's The Strongest Sage with the Weakest Crest. God, that show sucks. I am also counting Isekai Quartet, though it does end up being a black sheep a few times in the analysis. I'm not counting any other spin-off type shows though, like say Slime Diaries, because there's no reason for them not to be counted as part of the main franchise. One spin-off I would say counts as its own thing is SAO alternative Gun Gale Online, where it has a different cast and wasn't written by Reki Kawahara, but I haven't seen it yet, so it's not on here anyway. All things considered, I think this list is fairly representative as a sample of the isekai genre as it stands in anime, and that's really the scope of this. While most things on this list are based on light novels, though there are a few that are based on manga, like High Rise Invasion and I'm Standing on a Million Lives, and there's Isekai Quartet, which I think is based on fever dreams someone at Kadokawa might have had. The results don't really speak for the diversity in isekai that's out there in novels, manga, manhwa or other formats, just anime. So, onto the analysis. I went through each show and assigned whether they had certain features, so we can first see how many of the 48 shows do and don't have those features, and then look at them in combination to see how many have several or all of them. These were: do they have a male protagonist? Is the protagonist high school age or thereabouts? Is the isekai world the show's set in one that could be considered a generic fantasy world? Does the show have a harem thing going on with it? And finally, is the MC OP? Now, I'll talk in more detail about how I decided on what fit those criteria as we go through each one, as well as if there were any fringe cases that were difficult to decide, and if so, how I handled them. So first, we have the gender of the protagonist. Here we have male, female, or both, which applies to ensemble casts where there are two or more characters who count as isekai protagonists and are mixed between male and female characters. There were no shows on the list that didn't fit those categories, and I didn't do what Yahtzee did in his game analysis and break down their races, as all characters at least start off as human, and all of them are either Japanese or unspecified but can be taken as Japanese. There is one American isekai character I can think of, which is Glenda in I'm Standing on a Million Lives, but she doesn't join the main cast until very late in the show, and I'm really only mentioning this to preempt any actualies about it in the comments. There were a couple of fringe cases for male or female, such as Tanya the Evil, which is a male protagonist who is reincarnated as a girl, and this season's Life with an Ordinary Guy Who Reincarnated into a Total Fantasy Knockout, which has two male protagonists, but one is turned into a girl when they're isekai'd. And That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, where a male protagonist is reincarnated as a genderless monster and can use male, female or androgynous bodies. In all of these cases, I counted them as male, because that's what they were in our world, and since they keep their original inner selves intact when they're isekai'd, I would say they're intended to be seen by the audience as men, even if the world they're in sees them differently. For mixed casts, there were also some fringe cases, where there is more than one isekai character who could be seen as part of an ensemble group, but where it's also possible to argue that one character gets a lot more focus. An example would be I'm Standing on a Million Lives, where the whole party is isekai'd and can be seen as the protagonists, but you could also call Yusuke, who is male, the main character. This happens in reverse with High-Rise Invasion, where a lot of people are isekai'd, and you could say there are multiple protagonists, but Yuri, who is female, can also be seen as the main character. I did list High-Rise Invasion as having a female protagonist, but there were some of these I just couldn't really decide on, so I've given a range for how many count as having male protagonists versus mixed, and those fringe ones can also be counted as male for the purposes of looking at things like whether a show has, say, an OP male protagonist, once we start combining the categories. Shows I think definitely count as mixed include No Game No Life, which has two main characters in Shiro and Sora, Log Horizon, which has a fairly large group of people isekai'd, with several of them taking focus during the story. High School Prodigies Have It Easy Even in Another World, which has a mixed ensemble cast who are all isekai'd, and Restaurant to Another World, which is kind of one-shot stories about different characters, so varies by episode. I've also counted Isekai Quartet as mixed here, even though all of the 6 franchises featured in it have male protagonists, because I think characters like Aqua and Albedo have just as much prominence in the show as the characters who are the MCs in the shows it's spun off from. Plus, everyone in Isekai Quartet has been transported there, so they all count as isekai'd, and it's definitely an ensemble show. So, the results are 9 out of 48 have solo female protagonists. Between 6 and 9 have multiple mixed protagonists, and between 30 and 33 out of 48 have male protagonists. This is already lower than many people might have expected, given the reputation of the genre for male power fantasies, though the fact men are still the only protagonists at least 30 out of 48 times is probably also to be expected, given the majority of these shows are seinen or shonen, so traditionally targeted at men and boys. But whether the MC has peen or vagine is not really all that meaningful on its own. So now we know this, we can start looking at how many of these shows fit the generic teenage male otaku MC becomes OP and gets a harem in a generic fantasy world mold. So next, how many of the characters are high school aged? This tells us a couple of things, because it tells us how many of these shows could potentially have what we could call self-insert protagonists for the primary market that this genre of light novels and anime is aimed at. Now, not all high school-aged otaku MCs are blank self-inserts, and a 20-something salaryman MC can also be a self-insert generic protag, so it's not a foolproof measure of anything on its own, but it does help us to build up a picture. Here, for cases of reincarnation isekai where their age changes, I'm going with the age of the character pre-isekai. So Rudius from Mushoku Tensei, Mine from Ascendance of a Bookworm, and Lou from The World's Finest Assassin all count as adults here, for example. A fringe case here was the Faraway Paladin, where, at least where the anime is up to, we don't know enough about the MC's past life to really know how old he was. Here I'm going to do the opposite and go with teenager, because he is a teenager for most of what we see in the show, and with his memories of his past life being so vague, we can't really say he's just continuing on as that same character mentally, like Rudius or Lou are. I applied the same logic to the wise man's grandchild, where the fact he's reincarnated is more or less irrelevant in the story, and it's mostly about high school, so he's counted as a teen as well. Here we get the first real surprise, because 25 of the 48 shows, so just over half, actually have adult protagonists. So that's 24 working adults and Rudius. If we now combine this information with the gender breakdown, we find that of 48 shows, actually only 16 have teenage male protagonists. I don't think we know enough about all of the characters pre-isekai to really say how many of them would count as otakus or gamers or anything like that. But it's still a surprisingly low number, meeting even just the first two criteria for being generic self-insert male power fantasy harem Kirito clone shows. Next, I looked at the settings the characters in the story end up in, and whether the setting can count as a generic fantasy world. I'm actually being really broad with this, because while I may think that, say, ReZero has a really interesting world with a lot of original things to it, the feel, by design, in both it and many of these other shows, still is that sword and sorcery, only also with catgirls feel, that has that familiar fantasy world medieval European thing going on with it that we can instantly recognise. For the one reverse isekai, The Devil is a Part-Timer, I'm counting the fantasy world the characters came from instead of, well, Japan. And I think we can call that a fairly typical fantasy setting from what we get to see of it. I'm also counting SAO as having a generic fantasy setting, because while it has multiple settings throughout the series, only Gun Gale Online doesn't have that feel. Now, being that strict about what isn't a generic fantasy world, there are actually only a few shows that I can't say do have a generic fantasy setting out of the full list of 48. These are Tanya the Evil, High Rise Invasion, No Game No Life, Welcome to Demon School Iruma-kun, which I guess as a kind of quirky version of Hell isn't that unfamiliar of a setting, but doesn't fit the normal D&D campaign pseudo-medieval style, and finally the Black Sheep Isekai Quartet. All of this, to me, doesn't really point to a lack of originality. I mean, fantasy RPGs are also more often than not set in this kind of world, and isekai does tie in closely to those, meaning a fantasy setting of that type can actually be an interesting one to use for this type of story, even because it brings with it a certain familiarity, and that means you don't have to explain everything, and the characters can also have some expectations about the setting, which you can either play straight or subvert. It is also kind of part of the expectation of the genre, so you have to have a particular concept you really want to use for the story in mind to want to do something else. Kind of like you'd have to have a particular concept in mind to set a sci-fi story in the past. Still, it does mean that of our teenage male protagonists, only No Game No Life's Sora and Iruma-kun don't get to have their isekai adventure in a typical fantasy world. But now we come to a nice spicy one: harems. Now here I know that people can and very much will argue, until entropy claims the last speck of light from the universe, about whether certain shows like, say, ReZero count as harems or not. And I'm not about that life. So what I'm considering here is whether the protagonist gaining a harem or pseudo-harem type situation feels like something that's supposed to be a feature of the story, that was included by the author specifically for the enjoyment of people who like harems. This is different as an intention from simply including a lot of female characters with appealing designs, because waifus included because the audience might like them and they're entertaining to have in the story in their own right, are different from waifus who all love the protagonist, in terms of what kind of fantasy you're creating. Now, of our 48, some shows have confirmed harems, where the protagonist literally marries a bunch of people, so obviously those count. These would include Isekai wa Smartphone and The Eighth Son, as well as at least one series that doesn't suck. Some the protagonist doesn't actually get with any of the harem due to inexperience or being typically oblivious, or the author paired him up with a single love interest early in the story before realising he actually wanted to do the harem thing, SAO. But it's still clear from the ecchi feel or the way the characters interact that the harem dynamic is intentionally part of the show, like in How Not to Summon a Demon Lord. Sometimes the harem is more of the rom-com type variety, where it seems like the protagonist will choose just one in the end, but is going to take their time about it, and the dynamic of different people vying for their attention is part of the appeal, like in My Next Life as a Villainess. In any of these cases, I'm calling it a harem, but in cases where it's more just like someone interacts with a lot of people who the audience might think are good waifus or husbandos, perhaps say being in a party with them, but who aren't really filling a harem member-like role in the plot, such as in ReZero, Shield Hero or Konosuba, I don't think we can say that the protagonist getting a harem is part of the formula making up the show, so I'm calling it not a harem. A lot of the harem feel can also depend on how characters join the cast. I mean, I think we can say No Game No Life has a harem feel for one protagonist, Sora, where it introduces new female characters one at a time in that harem-style way. And also for The Saint's Magic Power is Omnipotent, where new bishy dudes are introduced in a similar pattern. Normally, I've counted these as harem, but there are 2 shows on the list that introduce what could be seen as new waifu-type characters with that kind of structure, which I'm counting as not harems, because they both actually subvert it and have the protagonist end up with a single love interest and a more traditional romance plot by the end. These are Overly Cautious Hero and Full Dive, which are actually both by the same author, interestingly enough. Now, the one that actually caused me the biggest trouble here was I've been killing slimes for 300 years and maxed out my level. This is because it has all of the hallmarks of a harem show. The way the characters are added into the cast one at a time and then stay, the tropes and character designs some of the characters represent, and the occasional ecchi type joke about their interest in the protagonist. But since the protagonist is also female and doesn't seem to be romantically interested in any of the other characters, instead seeming to think of them more as a found family, I'm not sure it can be called a Yuri harem. So it's kind of more like something the audience could see as a harem, but which doesn't really have a harem protagonist, since the protagonist thinks she's in more of a found family type situation. I think the same could be said about Kuma 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 Bear, only since what would be the harem are all younger characters, there's more the feel that she's collecting little sisters, so the family thing for the protagonist is a bit more clear. In these cases, I've gone for not a harem, but if you disagree, then, well, it doesn't really matter to the end results anyway, as I don't think anyone's ever levelled the criticism against the isekai genre that it has too many Yuri harems. So, the results. Of the 48 shows, 16 either had confirmed harems or had harems as what I would call a selling point. 2 of these were female-led shows, My Next Life as a Villainess and The Saint's Magic Power is Omnipotent. So that's 14 male leads or mixed shows where a male protagonist has a female harem. There were no yaoi harems, incidentally. Of the 14 male harem protagonists, only one wasn't in a generic fantasy world. That's Sora from No Game No Life, leaving 13 that could meet the SAO clone criteria. If we then knock this down to only the teenage, potentially self-insert type protagonists, we're left with just 9, one of which, of course, is SAO, so 8 potential SAO clones. But before I look at what those shows are, we have one more feature that generic isekai shows are said to have. So let's look at how many of the 48 have it. An OP protagonist. Now, personally, I think OP protagonists can make for really entertaining stories, such as in Overlord or Overly Cautious Hero, and it can also be fun and satisfying to watch someone become crazily strong, like in So I'm a Spider, So What? I don't see an OP protagonist as a negative, but I don't think anyone would argue that it can also be boring, when it just feels like the point is to show a self-insert protagonist being awesome, rather than to create an interesting plot, such as in Isekai wa Smartphone. But we're not really here to look at how it can be done well or badly, at least not in this video, only to see how many of the modern isekai shows can be considered power fantasies. Here, my criteria for an OP protagonist is that they're unusually strong for the world they end up in, because of something special about them that relates to them being isekai'd. They don't have to be the absolute strongest in the world, so I am counting Rudius from Mushoku Tensei as OP, even though he's not really in the context of the setting, because he does have special things about him that mean he can do things others in the setting can't, or can do them more easily, and he does become very strong. I'm going to deem basically having any kind of big advantage that is granted to the character relating to being isekai'd as meeting the power fantasy criteria, even if the character isn't overpowered to a ridiculous degree. Because I think that's more what the spirit of the "is it a power fantasy" question actually means. With reincarnation stories like Mushoku Tensei, Assassin Aristocrat, The Wise Man's Grandchild, So I'm a Spider, or Faraway Paladin, I don't think it's necessary for the OP-ness to present itself immediately, because they're usually reincarnated as babies. But if they have, say, an unusually high affinity for magic or something as they're growing up, or gain super strong artifacts or blessings from gods or whatever, they still count. For characters who are summoned rather than reincarnated, the OP-ness is usually pretty much instant, as we see in Overlord, Isekai wa Smartphone, and How Not to Summon a Demon Lord. ReZero is a tricky one, because Subaru has no particular advantages in terms of magic or combat, and so classes as a fairly average man in the setting, in terms of being able to hold his own in a basic fist fight due to having good physical fitness, but being incredibly weak compared to just about everyone else who's important in the plot. But some would still say that Return by Death is an extremely OP ability, and of course it does make him special and unique. I think it could be argued either way whether he's OP, but since the spirit of this is to see how many of the shows are power fantasies, and I think it's pretty insane to say that that's what Subaru is, I'm not counting him as overpowered. Now, what I'm also not counting as OP is people who are only strong in the new world because of skills, talents, or high intelligence they already had before being isekai'd. Shiro and Sora in No Game No Life are exceptionally good at games, which makes them feel OP in the world of games, but isn't something about them that's changed. Kinji in Make You Black Company was a successful entrepreneur in the real world, so it's the existing skills, ideas, and knowledge he has that lets him dominate in the isekai world. The reason is that this is only a power fantasy if you happen to be a genius or have the same skills and abilities as the protagonists, so it's not a generic, average person that could be you is given extraordinary powers type of model. You would think then that Kirito from SAO might count as this, because it is his skills as a gamer and his existing experience as a beta tester that make him OP in SAO, at least in the first arc. But in this case I'm saying no, because what Kirito is good at in Aincrad is sword fighting, and in real life we see that his skills at Kendo are mediocre. Having his stats and skills from the game applied to him in this new reality are what make him OP. So in that respect, he's really more similar to Ainz than to someone like Sora, who was good at playing games in the real world, and so is simply still good at playing games in the fantasy world. Another character who this does apply to, but who I've counted as OP anyway, is Lu from Assassin Aristocrat, because while he was the world's finest assassin, and those skills are part of what help him in his life in the New World, he is also granted skills by the goddess, and these allow him to become OP at stuff like magic. So, with all of that out of the way, the results are that 26 of the 48 had OP protagonists. There are 5 of these where it's either the whole point of the story or played more for comedy, which include Didn't I Say to Make My Abilities Average in the Next Life and Overlord. There are also, interestingly, 5 where the protagonist is actually weaker than average for the setting, so they have disadvantages rather than advantages. These include Welcome to Demon School Iruma-kun, where Iruma is the only human in a world of demons and can't use magic normally. ReZero, which I've already discussed. Shield Hero, where the protagonist is heavily disadvantaged compared to the other 3 heroes at the start. And Ascendance of a Bookworm, where the protagonist takes over the body of a frail little girl who actually died. But Ascendance of a Bookworm I have counted as both weak and OP. This is because mine is uniquely strong when it comes to mana, and this becomes an advantage. It just isn't during the early part of the story when she isn't involved in any of the magical side of the setting. Since the anime has shown both the weak and inherent OP-ness of the character already, I'm counting her as both. So, how does this affect our 9 shows that already had teenage male protagonists with harems in a generic fantasy world? Well, actually, it doesn't. All 9 of the shows that met those criteria also had OP protagonists. So we can say that 9 shows, including SAO, have all of these features, so 8 could feasibly be called SAO clones. Now, let's look at what these shows actually are. We have The Fruit of Evolution, Isekai wa Smartphone, Tsukimichi Moonlight Fantasy, The Wise Man's Grandchild, The Eighth Son Are You Kidding Me?, Isekai Cheat Magician, Arifureta, and Master of Ragnarok and Blesser of some word people who know about Norse mythology can say. Now, I think to some extent we could take off Tsukimichi Moonlit Fantasy, because it's more of a comedy isekai than anything, and does have some more unique ideas in it that contribute to that. And I would also say that The Fruit of Evolution can't really be seen as playing it straight. But if we take those off, I think we actually do get a list of the most generic shows in the genre by most people's standards. And to be honest, many of the ones on the list of 48 that I would say are the worst. I mean, I have heard Arifureta is a lot better in the novels, and I haven't even finished the anime, so I don't know how much it deserves to be called one of the most generic or even worst isekai shows, but certainly the others. The Eighth Son, for instance, was the show I made the very first video on my channel about, because I felt the need to talk about why it was so bad, even at smashing together the features of a basic isekai story. Isekai wa Smartphone is something people pretty much only like ironically, and Master of Ragnarok and blah 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 blah, well, that was dog water. But I've never heard anyone say otherwise. It's possible to enjoy these shows. It's possible to actually prefer a story that has all of these features to one that doesn't. And there's nothing wrong with it if you do, don't get me wrong. But what I think is interesting is that the shows that came out as having every feature that could be said to have been ripped off from SAO are what I would certainly say are the least popular and talked about isekai shows. The ones used really only as an example of how bland it can get, rather than shows with passionate fans in their own right. There's something to watch when you want to relax with some mindless entertainment. They can have some characters that are nice. There's nothing wrong with thinking they're alright, but when people talk about the hype around isekai, it's never these shows that anyone is hyped about. And they only make up 6, 8 if you even include the more comedy-focused ones, of 48 isekai series. So that's the main conclusion, really. There aren't as many generic shows as people make out, but those that are generic also tend to be the least, well, good, but also the least popular. Before I go though, I want to note a couple of other interesting things from the data. For one, there were very few shows that met none of the criteria. Actually, the only one that met none at all was Isekai Quartet, and that's only because I didn't count it as having an OP protagonist since it's an ensemble thing and not really a power fantasy. But I mean, really, it has several overpowered protagonists, so this is just another case of Isekai Quartet producing weird results. Now that's to be expected, where only 5 series didn't have the generic fantasy setting. But if we ignore that feature to broaden things up, there were only 2 others. One is Restaurant to Another World, which is another kind of black sheep of a show, but the other is actually Log Horizon, which is alongside SAO as one of the oldest anime adaptations of an isekai web novel or light novel on the list, and which, when it was new, was always kind of pitted against SAO in arguments about which one did the whole people mass transported into an MMO world premise best. It's kind of funny that it is, at least measured by these surface level features, the least like SAO of all the isekai anime. Still, on that bombshell, it's time to end the video. If you want to see me rank all of these 48 isekai shows, then check out my isekai tier list stream, which will be live tomorrow if you're watching this when it was first uploaded, or should be available to watch on demand on my channel now if you're watching this after the stream happened. Thank you as always to my supporters on Patreon and to everyone who helps me out by subscribing to my channel and watching my videos. Thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.